Hello and welcome to today's CDCT live session. I'm your host, Jason Rader from Insight's Cloud and Data Center Transformation Division. Today we're talking about containers and orchestration. And as our guides on this journey, we have Juan Orlandini, our Chief Architect, and Chris Kapusta, one of our Principal Architects here at Insight CDCT. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey, Jason. Good to see you again.
Morning. Thank you for having us.
All right. So I kind of set it off. I think the real title of this should probably be Battle of the Control Plane. You know, the movie that probably sits between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, as far as the trilogy goes here. But so let's kind of set the stage for what we're trying to talk about. Let's talk about containers and their relationship to what we're talking about at the orchestration layer. Who wants a shot?
I'll take a first stab at it, and then Chris can jump in. So containers are a proven technology by this point, right? It's in production, lots of people are doing it, and it's being well managed. But for a while, there's been a struggle as to, not a struggle, I don't know that that's the right word. There's been a effort to figure out how to manage these large fleets of containers. Because by their very nature, containers are very ephemeral. They come and go, and you can create them, and that's actually one of the big values of them, right? So managing that fleet, that whole set of services that are created with containers, it's been pretty challenging. And there's been a number of different technologies from a variety of vendors, both open source and public, and as well as commercial stuff, that have been aimed at managing that stuff. And what seems to be the winning choice right now is this thing called Kubernetes that most people have probably heard of by now. But that's kind of just the beginning of it, because you still have all of the rest of the stuff that goes around Kubernetes that enables Kubernetes. And there is not a clear winner to who should own Kubernetes and who should be running Kubernetes. So what you're seeing in the market is a lot of offerings from vendors like VMware. Tanzu's offering as an entry into that thing. You have IBM/Red Hat with OpenShift, but you also have the public cloud providers with their entries into the data center as well, because they've had their orchestration and their implementations in the public cloud, but now they're trying to reach into the private data centers and create a hybrid model of some sort. So you have Outposts, and you have Azure HCI, and as well as Google offering. Gosh, I'm blanking out on it right now.
Anthos.
Thank you. and all of those are entries into the data center. And if you look at it one way, is the on-premises guys are trying to run their stuff in the public cloud. The public cloud folks are trying to run it on the private data center. So it's really a battle of who's going to own the control plane, who's going to manage all of this stuff that's happening. Because when you own that control plane, you end up owning the rest of the stuff that comes around it, and to some degree, managing all of that is the battle, right? Would you agree with that, Chris?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, containerization is a very proven technology at this point, and it just becomes, where do I run them? How do I run them? How do I orchestrate them? How do I manage them? And then that's and even within the management plane, who's plugging into that management plane to add value? Those are all the, I'll say, battles, for less of a better term, that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and another view of this that might be illustrative, all right, is that this is a infrastructure lens that I just shared, and Chris and I just talked about, right? This is looking at it from the infrastructure perspective. The developers that are consuming these things, they don't care about the management plane. They don't care who owns the container infrastructure, who owns the storage. They just want to be able to make an API call and get this thing that delivers them those services. And it could be the networking side, it could be the storage side, or it could be some higher level API that does vision, or machine vision, or natural language processing, or whatever, right? And so you got to look at it from both sides, right? Is how does the developer get a contract from the infrastructure people, right? That they can subscribe to, and they know that if they write an application, that this thing is going to remain relatively stable, And then the infrastructure people to take a look at this stuff and say, hey, I got to manage this and control it and make sure my costs remain bounded by some sort of a box. They don't go out of control, right? So you got to look at it that way as well. Got to make sure that as you're managing and understanding how this control plane gets figured out, that there's an application developer view as well as the infrastructure view that plugs right into it.
So I hadn't thought about this before, but ideally it's abstract to the developer, correct?
Ideally, but it's a leaky abstraction is the term for it.
Sure. Well, that's what I was trying to say. Is there one, that we talked about a lot of players in the game? Is there one that's kind of better for the developer side? I mean, I typically think of infrastructure leading this conversation, but now I'm kind of saying, hey, are the developers kind of interested in this as well?
Absolutely. And we actually see that inside of our own organization, where we have developers that have been, because of the nature of what they do, been forced to learn some of this stuff,
Right.
And our developers know how to run Kubernetes, but they don't want to run Kubernetes. They want to consume Kubernetes, right? And then we have our infrastructure people that have grown up as virtualization or physical machine people that are looking at this container thing and like, that's a lot of programming that I got to do to manage that thing. It's not really programming. It's just, you don't use a GUI, you use CLI, or you use a configuration file or some Python scripting, right? But that's how you manage this stuff. And so it's a different way of looking at it, and you kind of have to meet in the middle,
So Chris, if you're out doing this kind of stuff, right, it sounds like this is at best maybe a tertiary solution as they're on their way to something else. How do you kind of handle that?
Yeah, I think with anything, this industry is constantly maturing. And a lot of the conversations we're having right now is kind of bringing those two groups together. This is one of those technologies where it can't just be an infrastructure look. It can't just be a development look. It has to be those two groups really coming together and both of them getting kind of outside their comfort zone. Developers see a lot of this as just the magic under the hood. I make an API call and something happens. But for the infrastructure folks, it's keeping the lights on. It's making sure that everything those developers need is supported, and performance and security and data protection and all of the things we wrap around traditional infrastructure still applies here. We just have to adapt it to this new way of thinking and this new way of operating. And as Juan said, there's not a lot of GUI driven solutions around this today. It's a lot of uncomfortable things that some of the infrastructure admins have to learn to be able to adapt and manage in this new world.
Why isn't there a GUI?
A lot of these technologies come from more of a developer-centric background, and they're not used to working in GUIs. Command lines, API calls, Python scripts, Ansible, all of the different kind of automation and interaction technologies out there, and API-driven technologies. That's where a lot of this was born and bred, and GUIs are an afterthought, or maybe not even a thought, because it's just not what that type of person is used to.
So another way to think about that portion of it is that a lot of this stuff, when it's managed properly, it's done so that it's repeatable, right? That's one of the big parts of doing this thing, is that when it's done at its correct way, the developers checking in source code and the infrastructure people that are working side by side with them are checking in the state of the configuration of the environment, all right? And by checking in, I mean they're putting it into a source code control system, something like a Git or whatever, right? One of those things. And the nice thing about it is then you know that, hey, my application ran with the infrastructure looking like this. And if either one of these breaks, then you can bring it all back to this known good working state, okay? And so these configuration files are what's called declarative. Rather than imperative, right? These configuration files, you say, this is what I want the state to look like. And then the system goes and figures out what that environment should look like based on this desired state. GUIs are very imperative in what you say, all right? You say, do this, click on this, click on this, click on this, all right? Does not say that GUIs can't support a declarative mode, but they tend to be much more imperative. And it's kind of the way we grew up managing systems. Do this 10 steps. and then I'll forget that I did them, and then the next time hopefully I documented them, and then whatever. And that's not what this new world and the new thing that everybody's trying to do wants to do. Is they want to have, it's like, I know it works like this because it worked with this, and then we're good. All right, and it's really hard to do that with a GUI. Really, really hard to do that with a GUI, right?
Yeah. No, I figured it out as you guys were talking. I mean, the GUI is typically used for something you're going to do over and over and over again, and that's kind of the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish here, right? We're trying to make it so that we do it once, and then it's a routine that runs as we instantiate these containers.
That's part of it. So be a little careful, right? The GUI.
There.
The GUI actually lets you do things in one-offs very easily.
Got it.
Okay? And by codifying things and making them these state definitions, right? Mm-hmm. You can make sure that it's repeatable, and that's the difference, right? Repeating over here requires this. Repeatable over here means that I've actually captured this, put it into there, and I don't have to worry about it anymore, right?
Perfect. Right. Understood. So, is there a time where we're going to arrive? Absolutely, everything's going to be containerized.
Definitely.
I amuse you.
It's one of those. It's one of those technology wars that often exist inside of an environment. I mean, to say containers are going to take over everything, I think is not doing it justice. There will always be a need for traditional monolithic applications, virtual machines, physical machines. They'll all have their place, and that's okay. Not everything has to live into a container. And I'd argue a lot of applications need to be rewritten from scratch if you want to containerize them. If you really want to take advantage of all of the features and functions and benefits that containers bring to these applications. So everything has a place, and it's always finding the right technology for everything. So we'll see a lot of coexistence between containers, VMs, physical servers, on-prem, public cloud, all of those different permutations.
And heck, there's also evolutions that continue to happen on that, right? So there's the serverless stuff that's happening now, and that's becoming a little bit of a buzzword right now. I heard a vendor the other day tell me that what they offer is serverless containers. And I was like, dude, that runs on something.
Bingo. Yeah.
There's nothing that just runs. Okay, it runs on a server somewhere, right? What you're offering is a different level of abstraction, so I don't have to worry about it as much as a developer. I get it, all right? But it is not serverless, right? But that being said, there is service offerings in the public cloud that are now starting to appear in private implementations where you just write code and submit only code, and then the system goes and figures out where to run it. And there's a lot of effort, and both on the academic side of the house as well as the commercial side of the house, how to manage an environment like this. And then that's TBD, whether it's going to be the next thing, a thing that runs with all of these things. I don't know, right? I mean, heck, think about it this way. COBOL is still a thing.
Yep.
Right? And it's really important, right? And that's been around since the 50s, literally, right? So we're what, 70 years in, and I did that in my head, by the way.
That's nice.
That's the chances that virtual machines are going to go away is almost none, right? They might evolve and change in nature. Their importance might wane a little bit, but they're not going to go away. Same thing with physical servers. They're not going to go away. We might reduce our need for dedicated physical boxes. And we've seen a lot of that. That's what the virtualization world did for us. Containers are no different than that. So there's benefits to all of those. Mm-hmm. And even some of the luminaries in the containerized world. There's a guy by the name of Kelsey Hightower. If you ever get a chance to meet him or listen to him, he's awesome. He's been a big proponent for containers, Kubernetes, the DevOps thing that really, we haven't even talked about that, but that's intimately tied to this whole thing that we're talking about, right? Earlier this year, he had an article that said, hey, monoliths might actually be a good thing, right? And his premise is that in order to do containerization and this Kubernetes thing and this orchestration thing and all that, you have to break up your application into these highly complex and difficult to abstract microservices, all right? You have to come up with the right abstraction so that you have a bunch of these little things that interact with each other. And for some applications, that's just too much work. Right?
Impractical, yeah.
Impractical. You can get it done, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do, right? And so monolith might be just perfect. And if you're trying to get an MVP, a minimum viable product out the door, go build it stupid simple, prove that it works, and then break it apart and scale it or whatever it is that you're trying to do, right?
Yeah, we talked about the same aspect when we talked about automation. Why would you automate something that takes a crazy amount of time to automate and it's not worth it, right?
Right.
Same kind of a thing, exactly, right? Yeah, so there's a lot of effort in that, and then there's also beyond serverless functions as a service, whatever it is that it's called. There's other efforts that are somewhere in between serverless and containers. So these things called unit kernels that are out there, and there's other things that are out there. So it's TBD. The only thing that's constant is that it's not constant.
Yeah, it's constantly changing.
Nice. Well, so I mean, practically, so if there, it sounds like whenever there's kind of a nebulous approach to some things, there's got to be a tipping point as to why the folks that are engaging here are engaging. What do you see as that tipping point? What's the compelling reason that the folks who are engaging, even though there's maybe a de facto standard but no legitimate standard, what's making organizations make this change?
I think a lot of it is new workloads. So for example, workloads that need to scale to an unknown quantity. And that's really where containerization comes into play as a real benefit. It may be difficult to scale a traditional monolithic application. One use case I've seen quite a bit out there is as customers developing for mobile apps. How do I know if 10 people are going to use this, 1,000 people, or 1,000,000 people? Do I have the next Pokemon Go on my hands where it just explodes and there's no way I could size for that type of scale? And things like containers lend very well to those unknown workloads where I may need to run 10 instances, I may need to run 1,000 instances, but I may not need to run them all the time. How do I scale up and scale down easily based upon usage and time of day and bandwidth requirements and workload requirements? So that's a lot of what we see as a transition to these services as the workloads dictate.
Is it anything to do with not just the elasticity, but also the resiliency?
Resiliency is a factor of it. Even portability. I can run them on-prem today. I can run them in the cloud tomorrow and move them back and forth as my needs dictate. So absolutely.
And that portability is what ties back into that management plane. All right.
Exactly. There we go.
That's where I was going. Yeah, that's where I was going. So take us home. Take us home.
So, and that's the thing. So the containers are an enabling technology, but you still got to manage them, right? That management plane, if you own it, then you're the one that's going to more than likely own where those things are going to end up running, right? And there's a lot of difficult things that come with this thing. So Chris touched on some of them, right? So the scalability, that means that you have to redesign your application in a completely different way, right? Yeah. There's the old pets versus cattle conversation. Traditional infrastructure is more like cattle, pets rather than cattle. We baby them. I mean, my servers that I used to manage back in the day, they all had names, fun names, like Calvin and Hobbes characters and things like that, right? Modern design principle, especially for something that's going to scale to support a Pokemon explosion, you don't care about pet names. They're like cattle. You try to keep them healthy, but if they don't, you shut it down, reinstantiate, and move on, right? And then if the application grows or shrinks, you can do that easily because it's cattle, all right? But that's not easy. You don't write the application the same way. So that monolith versus microservices thing, monolith scales to a certain point, and then it's probably going to strain what it was built for, and that's the problem, right? Microservices will scale infinitely, but if you try to shrink it down, it becomes really over complex for something teeny tiny, right? And that's really where that decision matrix comes in. Is it going to be one of these things that known bounds? Well, let's develop it that way. Is it going to be one of these things potentially? Well, let's develop it that way. If it's something that you don't know, you roll the dice and you figure it out, right? So, and that's the art and science of what we do for a living.
So is it safe to say, as there are a lot of potential plays out there from a control plane perspective, that it's typically the vendor that you're already aligned with is typically where you're going to go in the future? Or What do people do now, I guess, is a good question.
That's a really good question. So I've had conversations with different sizes of organizations, all right? And it seems to be converging that they're going to roll with the partner that they're the most comfortable with already, because there's a lot of expertise that you have to go and learn, right? You know, if you're a Google native, a GCP native person, as an example, going and consuming AWS or going and consuming Azure is not as simple as learning another cloud. It's learning a completely new cloud, right? And if you're going to go from an on-premises thing and you're a VMware kind of a person trying to learn the cloud, oh my gosh, that's a whole different thing, right? So it depends on which direction you're coming from. The mental burden that you're asking to learn becomes much lower if you start with something that you know. And that's the trend that I'm seeing, right? Is people that are starting from the on-premises side, now that VMware is into the in the game, IBM's in the game with their acquisition of Red Hat, they're tending to stick with those partners because they don't know, right? And they very well could be the perfect answer. So nothing against those guys, right? And the cloud native folks, and I'm using lowercase cloud native on this, the folks that are born in the cloud and live in the cloud, not the cloud native as in the development methodology, right? That's uppercase. Those folks are going to try to stick with something like an Anthos or a Azure HCI or a Outpost or something that gives them that familiar experience, but then gives you the on-premises benefits as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, as we all try to do, is avoid lock-in. Which partner gives me the most flexibility, where today I may be in Cloud X and I may be on-prem, and tomorrow it's Cloud Y and Cloud Z. So how do I pick a partner that gives me that flexibility where I'm not tied to a specific technology? I think that's something we all try and avoid especially in these kind of new frontiers, if you will, with containers and orchestration.
So Chris, who do you think who's making this decision? Because it seems like there's definitely a couple of different parties in the mix, right?
I think that varies organization to organization. Some I see that development drags the infrastructure guys kicking and screaming, and then they've kind of forced their hand and make them make a decision. You know, others that have moved more towards that mature DevOps model, I think it's a joint decision between the two of them, and it's really again, it's really choosing where do things need to run, what kind of portability do I need, and flexibility do I need, that drives a lot of those decisions. So I really think it just varies organization to organization.
Who should make the decision? There's the grenade.
Yeah, I'm putting the pin back on that and handing it to Juan.
I got it. The right way to do this is that you actually have the developer side of the house and the operations side of the house make it together. Okay. But the practical thing is what Chris has mentioned, is the practical side of it is that it might be the development side of the house. It might be a line of business that's trying to get a project done or something done, right? That actually ultimately ends up making that decision and then hands it to ops to go run it, right? And it's kind of shadow IT, but not really. They're just trying to get their job done, right? And there's nothing wrong with that because the job is getting done, right? But in a best case, the infrastructure folks that have always had the controls, the measures, the GRC, the security, all that other stuff get involved, so the developers can do their thing, and the IT folks that have 70 years of experience running data centers, whether they're public or private or whatever, can do their thing, and that's when you get the magic happening. Right, so it's ideal both. Practically, is probably one or the other. Right.
Understood. Well, it's been a fun conversation. So as far as the battle of the control planes, I don't think we've determined a clear winner here, but we've determined that it's a journey that you shouldn't necessarily wait if you've got a compelling reason to get going on, and there's definitely a lot of support related to that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily wait on the sidelines and see what happens, but it's dip your toes and plan and go cautiously, and I think we'll see how this comes to fruition as time marches on. So,
yeah,
fantastic. Well, gentlemen, as always, it's been a pleasure. I'm sure we'll be back. This is too much of a conversation to have in just a short amount of time. For everybody that's joined us, we thank you. And if you'd like to have more information related to the other things that we've talked about, feel free to visit us at insightcdct.com. Thanks and have a great day. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.